as I already alluded to this framework, this is from a paper that was recently published, and I have already given you the reference for that, and towards the end of this framework I will put that reference again. Okay, so this CLEAR framework is also a framework that could be used for prompt engineering, and as I said, why frameworks are important? It gives you a series of steps to think about using a tool in this setting, right? So when we are talking about CLEAR framework, it has 5 different components, and the C component of this framework is called concise, right? So when you're providing prompts, you need to be more concise rather than verbose, and that typically leads to better results in prompt engineering. And here is an example of a verbose example. Right? Can you provide me with a detailed explanation of the process of photosynthesis and its significance? Right? You can rephrase this, and according to the framework, what you should do is you should be more concise, where you can explain the process of photosynthesis and its significance, and you are not using a verbose prompt, and that is typically seen as an effective strategy by the people who have published this paper. So this is about being concise. Let's take another example. Example 2: provide me with an extensive discussion of the factors that contributed to economic growth during the last few decades. So if we are asking that, we can rephrase this prompt, and we can be a little bit more concise by just rewriting this prompt in such a way where we are asking the prompt, or we are providing a prompt, identify factors behind China's recent economic growth. So we have taken this and converted it into a more concise prompt. So this is the strategy, or this is the first step, of the framework, concise, where the goal is to be concise and not verbose when you're providing the inputs to the interfaces like chatgpt. Second letter of this CLEAR framework, L, stands for logical, right? And the idea is logical prompt emphasizes the significance of sustaining a logical flow and order of ideas within a prompt, right? And this is what they want to emphasize. So one example that is from the paper itself is like, describe the steps in the scientific method, starting with forming a hypothesis and ending with drawing conclusions. So what you're doing, you're providing a logical prompt that has multiple different steps, and there is a flow of idea, and typically prompts which have this logical structured aspect in them tend to give you better answers out of a chatgpt type of interface that you can get. Let's move on to the third letter of the CLEAR framework, which is the letter E, and that stands for explicit, right? So when you provide prompts which are more explicit rather than implicit, it's always going to be better in terms of what you get out of the output from the chatgpt framework. And this in general is true, right? Rather than you stating something implicitly, if you are more explicit about it, people can understand it better, and that idea is reflected also in the prompt engineering aspect about where you can be more explicit. So here is an example of being implicit. Tell me about the French Revolution. This is very generic prompt, and what you can do is you can be more explicit with respect to such a prompt and rephrase this prompt to be more explicit, where we are asking the chatgpt to provide a concise overview of the French Revolution, emphasizing causes, major events, and consequences. And so what we are doing is we are explicitly conditioning the kind of outputs that we want out of the chatgpt interface, and this is the main idea behind the explicit aspect of the CLEAR framework that is out there. Here is the second example. What are some renewable energy sources? Again, implicitly you are assuming that chatgpt knows everything about renewable energy sources, but you can provide a prompt which is a little bit more explicit than what is given in this exam. So identify 5 renewable energy sources and explain how each of this works, right? And if you're doing that, then you are setting up an example or explicit prompt that is going to lead to better responses from the chatgpt interfaces that is there. Okay. Now, A in this framework, CLEAR, stands for adaptive, and which essentially boils down to flexibility and the customization, right? So what I want to do is I want example, right, where you can be more adaptive in the uses of the prompt engineering interfaces. So for example, let's say you started with a prompt which is discuss the impact of social media on mental health, and you got a response, and hopefully the response was not that great, right? It was too general and not very useful, and you got a poor response out of the chatgpt interface. Then in that setting, what you can do is you can consider a more focused prompt and you're creating flexibility in your prompting, and you can probably examine the relationship, and you provide a prompt that says that examine the relationship between social media users and anxiety in kids. Right? So you're changing and you're adapting the initial answer that you get. Obviously, as you know, this is a chat interface, and it always have a context of the previous interactions that you have done. So it has a setting, it has got a context, and now when you're adaptively and flexibly changing the prompt with respect to the same question and revising that, in these settings, you might get better output and responses from the interfaces like ChatGPT. Here's another example where you are asking or giving a prompt, what are some ways to conserve water, right? Again, this is too broad, and if that does not lead to a good response or a very generic response, then what you can do is you can try to improve and become more targeted and adaptive and provide adaptive prompts, which would be something like this. List household practices for conserving water and their potential impact, right? So you're modifying this and you're becoming more targeted and providing prompts which is probably going to lead to better information or useful information that you get out from the ChatGPT interface. So this is the adaptive aspect of this framework, and which brings us to the final letter R in this CLEAR framework, which stands for reflective. So the reflective component in the CLEAR framework emphasizes the significance of continuous evaluation in enhancing prompt engineering techniques. Okay, so it wants to assess the results that you got out, right? So what you can do is, after receiving the AI generated content, let's say on the benefit of a plant-based diet, evaluate the response's accuracy, relevance, and completeness, right? Now, note that this is not a prompting strategy. This is more after the responses that you've got, you're thinking about the output and checking the facts and so forth and so on. And so this reflective aspect is also an important aspect. You need to reflect on the output and response that you got after interacting with the interface like ChatGPT, and not take everything as a truth, because as I said, like, there are very fundamental issues with large language models, and because of that, reflecting on the responses becomes very, very important.